Before NVIDIA released the RTX 2000 series of graphics cards to focus on the then new technology of ray tracing, they instead had a different goal: to make the fastest GPU that they could. And while obviously AMD was trying the same thing, and every different generation of graphics card or GPU architecture has its pinnacle, the 1000 series on the Pascal architecture did something incredible. By pushing the node as far as they could, they came out with the GTX 1080 Ti and the Titan XP. And while at the time they were hands down the most powerful gaming cards on the market, almost 10 years later they've achieved almost a legendary status for being one of the longest lasting powerhouse cards ever made. Both of these graphics cards were released in 2017. The 1080 Ti was on March 10th, while the Titan XP was April 6th. Fun fact, the 1080 Ti and the Titan XP use the same graphics die, the GP102. The Titan XP can only take perfect GP102 chips, while the 1080 Ti has a few of its shading units disabled. Lots of graphics cards still do this, use the same chip for multiple boards, and it's called binning. Just thought it was neat that the peak of the architecture was used in both of these cards. Now for the actual specs, we'll start with the GTX 1080 Ti. It has 3,584 shading units, 11 GB of GDDR5X memory on a 352-bit memory bus, and a TDP of 250 watts. Core clocks are 1481 MHz base and 1582 MHz boost, with memory clocks of 1376 MHz. For 2017, 11 GB of VRAM was pretty crazy. In fact, I think it was the second highest amount of consumer card memory amounts, topped only by the Titan XP. Speaking of which, this is the Titan XP. This specific model is the Collector's Edition Jedi Order variant, but it performs the same as a regular Titan XP. I just thought it looked really cool. The Titan XP has just a tad more of almost everything over the 1080 Ti. It has 256 more shading cores at 3840, 1 more gigabyte of VRAM for a total of 12 gigabytes, also GDDR5X, and it has an extra 32 bits on the memory bus for a total of 384 bits. Core clock is actually lower by 76 MHz at 1405, but it boosts up to the same of 1582 MHz. Memory clock is slightly faster as well, by 50 at 1426 MHz. TDP is the same, however, at 250 watts. Both cards have two power connectors, a 6-pin and an 8-pin. And of course, both cards are the final release of the Pascal architecture, right before NVIDIA started focusing on ray tracing. Feels like just yesterday the first RTX demos were released, at least to me. For the games, the test system is the usual: i7 8700 non-K and 32 GB of dual-channel DDR4 running at 3000 MHz. Instead of the 1080p display, I'll be using a 1440p display just for this video. Very few cards that I have can run 1440p this well. All of the game presets are the same between both of the cards. Once again, Afterburner is misreporting the memory speeds by multiplying it by 4, so keep that in mind if you take a peek at the statistics in the corner, thanks to RivaTuner. One last thing, before any of the benchmarks, I've decided to overclock both of these cards. Although I'm sure it's not a very clean or efficient way of doing it, I did manage to get a little extra performance out of them. I just ran Unigine Heaven on the side while I increased first the core clocks and memory clocks bit by bit until Unigine Heaven would freeze or crash. Doing this for the 1080 Ti, I was able to get 125 MHz on the core and plus 250 on the memory, and for the Titan XP I got plus 125 on the core, the same, and 300 MHz on the memory. With the preamble out of the way, it's time to see how NVIDIA's final, purely raster-focused cards are still handling games, starting with the internet-renowned 1080 Ti. Starting with Forza Horizon 5 on the Extreme preset at 1440p, we got 63.9 FPS average with 1% lows down to 56.2. Strong start from this card, and frankly this preset looks fantastic. Even without anti-aliasing, at 1440p it looks smooth enough that I don't really think it's necessary, although that comes down to preference, and just from this benchmark alone it's safe to say it could handle it without much fuss. I decided to add 2 more tough-to-run games this video, since it seems these cards can do a whole lot more than the other ones I've ran. So here we have Cyberpunk 2077. Running on the high preset at 1440p native, the 1080 Ti achieved an average of 50.5 FPS and lows of 41.6 in the benchmark. I know that this game has been optimized since it launched, but for me, who's honestly never played Cyberpunk and only saw people talk about how intensive it was, seeing this result is a little shocking. To me, it just shows why the 1080 Ti is still talked about to this day. The second game I added was Helldivers 2, and running the high preset here at 1440p native, we got 59.8 FPS average with lows to 43.6. Close enough to 60 to feel pretty smooth, and 1% lows still above 30, so the few stutters don't feel that bad either. The biggest struggle is actually playing the game, so ignoring my gameplay, Helldivers 2 ran great. Back to the normal, lighter titles, we have Deep Rock Galactic, and running the Ultra preset at 1440p native, we got an average of 220 with 1% lows of 198. With more lighting effects active, like if you throw a bunch of flares, it could drop down to about the 145 FPS zone, but it quickly picks itself back up after the first load and returns to around that 220 average. Even if it did stay around that 145, there's no real issues to report with this game. Ran smooth and felt good. Next is Doom Eternal, and with the Ultra Nightmare preset at 1440p native, we had an average of 127 FPS with lows to 84. Looking across this outside section at the far distance and loading this whole street with a platform here, it could hit 90, but all of it is still super solid. Again, it's no wonder why the 1080 Ti is still held in such high regard. Here we have BeamNG Ultra preset, 1440p native, and we got an average of 75 with 1% lows of 62. It's possible with maps with more foliage you might drop below 60 for the 1% lows, or if you added traffic, but it'll still be close enough that it's really not an issue. Quick reminder, all of these are at 1440p and not the usual 1080p, and so far most of them have been above 60 FPS average, and that's not to mention all of the presets have been pretty high as well. Man, I miss the GPU landscape of 2017. Well, I guess the whole tech landscape. Now, one of my favorites, Risk of Rain 2. With all the settings to max at 1440p native, using the Artifact of Swarms to spawn double the enemies for added stress, we still had an average of 232.5 FPS with 1% lows to 195.5. This is just the first stage. Later stages, you'll definitely see that FPS go down quite a bit more, but it would take a lot to go below 60. I don't know if that's more of a testament to how light and then heavy this game is, or how powerful the 1080 Ti is. Either way, Roar 2 runs great. Coming up, we have Counter-Strike 2, where I ran two different settings. Starting with max settings at 1440p native, we had an average of 155 with lows to 75. For an even more competitive frame rate though, I decided to switch the aspect ratio to 4:3 and run 1920 by 1440. My friend said people do this to make the enemies wide. I also set all the settings to low except for dynamic shadows, which I set to the highest. With these settings, we got an average of 373 with 1% lows of 153. Lows the same as the average from competitive settings to max settings respectively. I don't think I'd see anyone complain about those frame rates. Finally, we have Minecraft. Since it's pretty obvious that with Sodium and Iris, the default vanilla graphics would run just incredibly fast, in excess of 600 FPS actually, I decided to benchmark with just the shaders, complementary reimagined. With the shader preset set to high at 1440p native, we got an average of 101 FPS with 1% lows to 92.4. And it looks downright fantastic too. Although that could just be because I like the snow. Okay, mostly because of the snow. Finally, to round out the 1080 Ti, I have the 3D Mark scores. With stock settings, we had a total of 29,582 on Firestrike, 9944 on Time Spy, and 2190 on Steel Nomad. After the overclock, reminder that's plus 250 MHz memory and plus 125 on the core, we got 30,275 Firestrike, 10,187 on Time Spy, and 2267 for Steel Nomad. Honestly, not that big of an increase, basically a 2.5% bump to the scores, probably because Nvidia's GPU boost in these cards was already pushing the clocks pretty high, and we are using a blower style cooler, so the cooling is not as good as it could be. Still, it is an increase, albeit barely. But the 1080 Ti is only half the story of Pascal's final stand. Remember, the 1080 Ti's chip is almost a perfect yield with no defects, but a few cores are disabled. To see what the 1080 Ti could do if it had just a few more working shader cores and a slightly bigger memory bus, we have to take a look at the Titan XP, the perfect Pascal card. All of the settings in-game are the same as the 1080 Ti benches, and the Titan XP is also overclocked with plus 300 MHz on the memory and plus 125 MHz on the core. Although again, didn't make too much of a difference as I was hoping that it would. With all that said, it's finally time to see the peak of Pascal. Jumping right into the benchmarks, we start off once again with Forza Horizon 5. Extreme at 1440p gets us 68 FPS average and 1% lows of 60, so already we're just a tad ahead of the 1080 Ti, about 5 more average and 4 more on the lows. Overall, it is slightly faster, but honestly not enough to notice. Cyberpunk 2077 is a different story though. Same settings, so high preset at 1440p, we had an average of 79.1 FPS with 1% lows to 52.9. That's an increase of 29 average FPS and 11 on the lows. My guess is the memory bandwidth as the frame rate increase culprit, because while we do have a few more shading cores, it can't be the only reason for an increase that large. It's only from 3584 to 3840 shading units. Whatever the reason, Cyberpunk on a Titan is a little astonishing. Helldivers 2, high preset at 1440p, we had an average of 63.2 with lows of 39.5. The lows were lowered by 4 and the average was higher by 4. Could have been down to the map or mission since it's randomly generated, but either way it seems close enough to chalk it up to run variance. Pretty close on both ends, and a stark contrast to the last game. Deep Rock Galactic running on Ultra preset at 1440p, we had an average FPS of 244.9 with 1% lows to 228.1. Average from the 1080 Ti increased by about 25, while the 1% lows increased by about 30, so tighter timings and an overall higher frame rate. Nothing to note about this run, was just faster and smoother. Is it enough to notice? Well, not really. Still impressive though. Next is Doom Eternal with the Ultra Nightmare preset at 1440p. Running this, we had an average of 129 with 1% lows to 90. Marginal increase over the 1080 Ti, just 2 FPS higher on average and 6 FPS higher on the lows. Nothing to write home about, but also worth mentioning. Here we have BeamNG, and running the Ultra preset again at 1440p, we got 78.3 FPS average with 1% lows down to 63.3. About plus 3 FPS average and basically the same 1% lows, so basically not that big of a difference. Just goes to show that increased shading cores and a higher memory bus doesn't always equate equally to higher performance. Risk of Rain 2 is up next, and on max settings at 1440p we had an average of 210 FPS with 1% lows to 163.5. Could be a difference in map, but that's the way roguelikes go. Either way, we actually saw a decrease in frame rate of about 25 average and 30 lows. Could be the stage, since it's not the same one, but in this game's case, the main thing to note is it still runs good. Honestly, it's not great for benchmarking, I just really like this game and like to see how each card performs in it. Anyhows, it still ran it great. In Counter-Strike 2, running with max settings at 1440p, the Titan XP returned an average of 165.8 with 79.6 lows. Slightly higher than a 1080 Ti, increase of 10 average and 4 lows. Switching to the 1920 by 1440 and low everything except high dynamic shadows, we got 396 average with lows of 166. Over the Ti, that's an increase of 23 FPS average and 13 on the 1% lows. Makes me think we were pretty close to the limit of Pascal in this game's case already. Finally, we have Minecraft, with Sodium and Iris and complementary reimagined shaders set to the high preset, and at 1440p, the final benchmark that the Titan XP returned was 115.6 FPS average with 1% lows to 107.9. With an increase of about 14 FPS average and an increase to the 1% lows of 15 FPS, we saw an increase in almost every game. Some were more dramatic, and some barely moved at all, but it was interesting to see how the game scaled with slightly more cores on the same architecture. And just to cap it off, I have the 3D Mark scores here, and for the Titan XP, at the stock settings, we had a Firestrike score of 30,621, Time Spy score of 10,314, and Steel Nomad score of 2351. Honestly, pretty close to the 1080 Ti's overclock scores, but that's just at stock. After the overclock on the Titan, plus 300 memory and plus 125 core, our scores went up by more than the 1080 Ti's did actually. Firestrike went up by 2210 to 32,831, Time Spy increased by 652 to 10,966, and Steel Nomad's score went up by 155, bringing it to 2506. That's an increase of about 6.5% for each score. Much better than the 1080 Ti's increase, which kinda makes sense. Higher memory bandwidth and more shading units all boosting higher would scale more. So that just about does it for this retrospective on the final, purely raster-focused cards from NVIDIA. After this series, NVIDIA would start deploying ray tracing cores, and the next series would drop the GTX title in favor of RTX in the form of the 2000 series. They really just went all in on ray tracing, but honestly, I was never a huge fan of ray tracing. Sure, it looks pretty cool sometimes, but the performance hit over rasterized was never worth it in my opinion. People have spent years trying to make rasterized look like it was tracing rays, so adding cores for it is a little strange, but overall it worked out well for them. And with the same mindset, these two graphics cards are still kicking strong. If you're not tracing rays, every game I threw at these cards passed pretty dang well, and even at 1440p. It's no wonder the GTX 1080 Ti is known as the GOAT, and the Titan XP is still known as a beast. They've definitely earned their reputation.